Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, here's part 2 of my interview with former federal prosecutor and constitutional law professor Kim Wehle, talking about her new book, The Pardon Power, and the danger of that power if it is ever returned to the hands of a criminal president like Donald Trump. And friends, if I could add one more thing, if you like the content that I put up on my YouTube channel, Justice Matters, please hit subscribe. I have been told that I am not a particularly adept YouTuber because I never do ask people to hit subscribe, so I thought I'd give it a try. Please hit subscribe. It's always free. Now please enjoy the second and final installment of my interview with Professor Kim Wehle.
But I think what you're talking about too, and we'll probably get to this, is the immunity case as well, right? Because Bill Barr, even after the immunity case, and I know your listeners and viewers know this well, the court manufactured out of thin air and in contravention of things like the take care clause or the impeachment clause that I just talked about that says you can prosecute people that are impeached, including presidents, presumably for official power, because people are impeached around their abuses of power. The court said that, oh, it's okay, you can run around and commit crimes in the White House. There's nothing you can do so long as you use the massive powers of the office, not your personal, private authority, right? So if you pull out a handgun that you keep in your top bedroom side dresser drawer and you shoot an intruder, that would be private power. But if you direct, a SEAL Team 6 to do it, that's protected. But here's the thing, Glenn, how do you get the SEAL team members to pull the trigger for you? They're not president. They're not going to be covered by this brand new immunity. What do? You do what Donald Trump did. You offer him a pardon. And then you follow through on the pardon. Sometimes lawyers and, really learned, thoughtful people, they'll say, oh, that'll never happen. Come on.
Oh, come on.
And I say, if that's the case, why do we have a constitution, Glenn? Why do we have laws? Laws are about disincentivizing bad behavior. That's why it's no more kings. That's why we have separated powers. The court just blew a hole in that system completely. We are going to see miscreant people abuse it. And Bill Barr said it's not going to cover bribes. Well, the court also said that the official power stuff can't be part of a prosecution. So a bribe is, I will use my official power to pardon you in exchange for money. Well, if you take the pardon part out of the case, all you have is giving somebody money. I mean, someone can give you money. That's not illegal. It's the reason that you got the money that makes it illegal, right?
And Kim, isn't it Justice Sotomayor who sounded the very alarm you just highlighted on the pardon front? Donald Trump could literally tell his Department of Justice officials or the military or constitutional powers to just go ahead and round up and put in detention camps all of my perceived enemies, and I will pardon you all for following my directions. And everyone goes off unaccountable, all immune from prosecution. And Justice Sotomayor, I think it was, made that exact point. And what did Chief Justice Roberts say? Get out of here. That's overblown. How is it overblown when the person who is seeking to retake the reins of federal power has said, I'll be a dictator on day one. I can pardon myself if I want to. I will pardon my little homegrown militia that I assembled on January 6th to attack the Capitol and try to unlawfully keep me in power. How is that overblown or just a wild hypothetical? I think it is directly in play, given who Donald Trump has shown himself to be.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think what is deeply disturbing even more isn't so much this moment, it's what if he gets in office? We have 4 more years, and like just happened in Venezuela, the voters come out and say, we don't want this abusive president anymore. We're going to vote him out of office. And then he's in charge and he just sends troops to the Congress and disallows the counting of ballots for a Democrat that would have him leave office. I mean, he said, listen, I just need you to vote for me one more time. So the pardon power and the message it sends, what the Supreme Court did. And in this survey I mentioned to you, the respondents were asked, what's the concern about pardoning this mini militia? from January 6th. And the response was, it also sends a message that political violence is going to be protected, that political violence is not only okay, but it's encouraged. You are patriots. It's the new America, which is devotion to a single person or else. And I also worry too. Say you're SEAL Team 6, Glenn. I'm not going to do that. I'm not even going to do that for a pardon. He's a vindictive guy. So
Right.
these people are in the position, if I don't go along with it and I don't accept the pardon, what happens to me? What happens to my family? I mean, the implications are so terrifying. And just the pat on the head that, oh, it's never going to happen. And all you have to do is flip on the videos of January 6, 2021 and the violence that day.
What great points. All right. This is something that I am so intensely personally interested in, and I'm so glad I get to ask you about it. It has to do with the Burdick case from 1915, right? So you have the Supreme Court saying, whether it's in dicta or that's the holding of the case, we'll set all that aside, that a pardon carries with it an imputation of guilt. And accepting the pardon is at least some confession of guilt. And the reason I think that case is so important today is because that issue is coming to a head up in New York. We have Steve Bannon, who was given a pardon by Donald Trump, which I think should offend almost everybody, whether you're a Trump supporter or you're not a Trump supporter, because Steve Bannon and some of his merry band of thieves came up with this We Build the Wall Foundation, took a bunch of money from Donald Trump's supporters, claiming we're going to build a wall on the southern border and we're not going to take a penny. And then Steve Bannon enriched himself and he was indicted federally. Of course, Donald Trump pardoned him, even though Bannon was stealing from Trump's supporters. And then the state of New York said, guess what, Steve? You're out of luck because your conduct also violated New York state law. And they charged him and he's pending a trial right now. Well, it seems to me, Kim, he accepted a pardon for a federal pardon, obviously, for identical conduct that he's now being prosecuted in the state for. If it were me, I like enforcing the law, especially against ruling class criminals, which is probably why I'll never be attorney general. But I would litigate the issue of whether Steve Bannon accepting a federal pardon for the same conduct for which he's now being prosecuted in state court, whether that can be admitted as an admission of guilt. The worst thing that the state court judge can say is, I rule that it's not admissible. But it seems that intellectually it follows from the Burdick case.
Well, Burdick involved basically a pardon in exchange for testimony. And the defendant said, I'm not going to waive my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So that stands for the proposition that there are limits on the pardon power. Other parts of the Constitution can limit the pardon power. And the Department of Justice guidelines, Glenn, do, for purposes of recommending pardons, Donald Trump bypassed them all. But there's a bunch of lawyers in DOJ that read all the pardon applications. And the guidelines do look to whether you accept responsibility for the crime. I agree with you. There is that precedent. Why not argue it? I guess the flip side would be, and I make this argument in the book, I mean, I'm a proponent of using the pardon power to maybe correct criminal injustice for purposes of commutation anyway. Say you've got someone who's on death row that is exonerated by DNA evidence. It's very difficult to get out of jail, even if you're innocent. And there's posthumous pardons, primarily people of color that were vindictively prosecuted based on race that have been pardoned afterwards. So if that were litigated, it would have to be sensitive to that, because if we're going to look at the benefits of a pardon, there are ways that presidents could use the pardon to address real innocence. And as you know, even under habeas corpus petitions, new evidence of innocence it doesn't get you out unless you can show there was some other problem with how the case was prosecuted. So it's a long-winded way of answering. Yes, his band of thieves and all of these blatant admissions of guilt on so many levels, including these pardons, should somehow come back to haunt them. It shouldn't be a clean, you walk away as if it never happened.
Okay, and let me finish up with what you say at the end of the book, with which I completely agree, and it may sort of inspire some more conversation. But Near the end of the book, you conclude, quote, the pardon power simply isn't working. It's hurting democracy and undermining basic notions of due process and fairness. It exacerbates income and race inequalities. It defiles the office of the presidency and the legitimacy of the criminal justice system. I agree with all of that. The whole pardon arena feels like a mountain of injustice with the occasional, righteous pardon being delivered. And certainly in the Trump administration, you list some of the most egregious pardons that I mean, they're just so offensive to any notion of morality, ethics. So, the question is, as bad as the pardon power is, where do we go from here? What is the realistic path forward in trying to correct what seems to be a hopelessly broken system?
It is a hopelessly broken system. And between the period of the kings in England and the ratification of the Constitution, there was this period called the Enlightenment, where these philosophical thinkers like Kant and Montesquieu debated the pardon power. Montesquieu was not a supporter of it, and he was kind of the brainchild of the separated powers in the Constitution. And one of the concerns, Glenn, was that as long as it's out there dangling, people won't worry about fixing it, because there's always that backstop of the pardon power. And the Supreme Court's used that excuse to keep people in jail who have proof of innocence. Oh, they can always be pardoned. It's not functioning that way. It really should either go or it should be tremendously limited. Now, how do you do that? Of course, the best case scenario would be a constitutional amendment because it's in the Constitution. Version number 2 would be presidents being pressured to have, as George Bush suggested, a policy in office and be held accountable politically from that policy. They could say, these are my criteria. Or they could have their own pardon commission that's not DOJ lawyers, no offense, but prosecutors, people that are within the prosecutorial office deciding whether the people they prosecuted and convicted should then also be pardoned is kind of a conflict of interest. So presidents could do it, but that requires education, which is what we're doing right now, or Congress. And I say in the book, there's some, as we mentioned earlier, basic limits, legislative limits, banning pardons in exchange for as a bribe, banning lobbying, basically not allowing people to take money, a lot of money, to use their access to get your pardon on the top of the pile in the Oval Office on the waning days. Banning pardons, and I think this would have a constitutional challenge, in the last 3 months of office, right? Or the last 6 months of office. Have the pardons have to happen before an election so the voters can vote on the pardons. Have a record of the pardons. In the early 20th century, presidents granted 50% of the pardon applications, Glenn, and they read every single one of them. Of course, there were fewer federal crimes. Donald Trump granted under 2%. We don't know what went on behind the scenes in Jared Kushner's iPhone in terms of who got pardons in exchange for what. Is it a pardon so that you're going to write a big check when I run the next time? I mean, that's despicable, and that's outside the scope of public scrutiny. So Congress would have to step up to at least make these efforts. And then, as you indicate, a president at his peril could challenge that as unconstitutional. It would have to be a president saying you're impinging on my power to pardon, which I think would be a political problem, right? To say I want more pardon. I mean, there could be. And then we'd get some clarity from the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, that immunity case is lingering out there with this really, really bad language in it, that the pardon is core and has not limits. And I mentioned this before. I mean, I have tremendous respect for, all of my colleagues and most of the colleagues in the bar, but certainly people at the Department of Justice. And when I was listening to that oral argument and the pardon power came up, and counsel for Jack Smith just, no caveat, said, oh yeah, the pardon power has no limits. I think that just indicates that there hasn't been enough thought and scrutiny and peeking behind the curtain of this mythology and distortion of pardons for corrupt reasons being somehow what kings can do because we have a king. No, we don't.
And I fear that Justice Sotomayor, and I appreciate and embrace everything she wrote in her dissent, has probably given Donald Trump a blueprint for just how dangerously he can abuse the pardon power with his, newfound powers of lawlessness, absolute immunity. And, boy, if he retakes the reins of power, I would expect him to do exactly what Justice Sotomayor cautioned against a corrupt president doing. Let me finish with this question, and it's really just for fun because there is no answer that we could possibly know. What do you think the odds are that Donald Trump has issued pardons that we don't yet know about?
We have some like brain connection because that's exactly what I was going to want to ask about, which is self pardons in the top drawer. So let's imagine that Kamala Harris wins the presidency and Jack Smith wins in the 11th Circuit that his appointment was constitutional. And that's just a silly argument. I'm still not convinced that when he was running around saying I could self-pardon, he didn't have that insurance policy someplace, right? So we could see that even under a Harris administration as a defense to a prosecution if one of these federal cases actually ends up getting a trial date. There is case law, however, that says that if you don't accept a pardon, it's not good. So I guess if he gave pardons, we'd have to see whether they were officially accepted. And I think the argument to your point would be, if this wasn't made public while he was president, it's a fake pardon. But sure, pardon's not going away, whether Donald Trump's in office or Donald Trump's not in office come January.
Yeah, of course, there's no legal requirement that a pardon be made public if it is privately delivered and privately accepted by the recipient and put in their back pocket. I love to use the term pocket pardons, which kind of borrows from pocket immunity, which is actually a thing. We don't deliver it until we need to deliver it. I have to believe that when it was Kellyanne Conway, I believe in her book, which I didn't read, but I read the New York Times book review of it, when she said toward the end of Donald Trump's term, he ambled up to her and said, her words, not mine, "Hey, honey, you want a pardon? Everybody's going to need one." And she said she declined it. Of course, she's also the queen of alternative facts. So who knows? But if he did that, do we really think he didn't offer pardons to, for example, his family members to quietly keep in their back pocket just in case charges are brought against them? Because look, Donald Trump was never one to forego a good grift. And issuing a bunch of pardons to family members or other loyalists or himself in case he needs it, how could he resist being the person he is? I would be shocked if we didn't see some pocket pardons produced sometime down the road.
So how do you think that would come up in a criminal case? So let's just like walk through that. So Jared Kushner's prosecuted.
And we are now on the same wavelength because that's the person I was thinking about. Go ahead.
So he moves to dismiss the indictment.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's unconstitutional by virtue of his pocket pardon.
First of all, I think there would have to be, because if it wasn't made public while Trump was presidency, there would have to be an evidentiary hearing to make sure that he, in fact, delivered it and it was accepted prior to Donald Trump leaving office. But if they could prove that, and that would be, I would think, easy to prove if you had it notarized or whatever at the time, then the court might have to tackle the question of whether a corruptly delivered pardon, depending on the circumstances that prompted Trump to give his son-in-law a pardon, whether a corruptly delivered pardon is just fine by the Constitution or not.
Could that produce a superseding indictment for a bribe?
I would like
if you're
to think
defense
so.
counsel, right? If you're defense counsel, you'd be like, whoa, maybe we don't want to do this because it could actually make our case more complicated. But you're right. You'd probably have to have an evidentiary hearing on that defense, setting aside the underlying charges. And then that's the kind of thing that would percolate up to the appellate court and ultimately up to the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, and we'll never know unless we try. And that's why I wish we would have some really forward-leaning, aggressive prosecutors who are interested in, raising this issue, litigating it, even if it's a long shot, because I just don't think our nation can long endure what I believe Donald Trump will do, or any corrupt, aspiring day one dictator who comes after Donald Trump. What they will now be able to do with a combination, as you have brought out, of the presidential immunity and the pardon power being almost absolute, that's a recipe to turn us into a banana republic.
Well, let me ask you this, too, because I wish I had the name of the book and the author, but I was listening to a podcast about a new book about the internal tension within the Justice Department since Donald Trump. And the takeaway, I'm paraphrasing, is that career prosecutors are now so even more hesitant to touch these high profile cases that no one really wanted to work on the Donald Trump prosecutions, or a lot of people pushed away from that the chill factor that we're talking about, that's always been an issue. I know you know it better than anyone that there's people want 100% beyond a reasonable doubt, not possibility, that is infected now career people. Is that something that you are attuned to as well? And is it something we should worry about? Because that gives me pause, even if it's a Kamala Harris administration.
I think part of the problem is we have an attorney general in Merrick Garland, who I still believe is a good, honorable man, but the wrong man for the moment. And he has just sort of laid back and not wanted to do anything that would be perceived, misperceived, or criticized as being politically motivated. And as a result, he seems to have done nothing, at least in a public facing way. I mean, Jack Smith has, obviously brought charges against Donald Trump. But think about it today, almost 4 years after the insurrection, not a single member of the command structure of the insurrection, right? The suits of the insurrection, the hierarchy, not a single one has been charged with a crime, but for Donald Trump. And we all see how that's bogged down. That to me is unacceptable. And I think it's a product of Merrick Garland and what he thought was the right thing to do by way of, restoring the public's faith in the Department of Justice. I think he was dead wrong about it. So when you talk about the sort of concerns or the timidity or the fear that might be experienced by others in the Department of Justice, I think it has to start at the top. And I don't mean at the president, I mean the attorney general. You need a fire breather who is going to go in there and say, listen, we're going to divorce from our work and our prosecutorial decisions everything but the facts and the law. And we're going to begin prosecuting folk who committed crimes against the United States that were designed or had the effect of potentially damaging or ending our democracy. And, results be damned. It doesn't matter if we win or we lose. If we have a good faith belief that we have enough evidence to obtain and sustain on appeal a conviction, we're going to trial, we're going to investigate, we're going to indict, and we're going to try these people. That is what has been lacking. And until we get that mentality restored to the Department of Justice, I fear we're not going to make the kind of progress on restoring the kind of health of our democracy. You mentioned, I don't want to go back to it, but the members of Congress who are still serving today, some of whom asked for pardons. And you only ask for a pardon if you believe you violated the law and you don't want to be held accountable. You want to get away with it. You ask for a pardon to try to excuse that conduct. We have sitting members of Congress who, in essence, under the Burdick case, have at least confessed in part to a crime and yet haven't been held accountable. How can we endure that? I don't think we can. I don't think we should be made to, but I think it starts from the top. And one thing I am so excited about is to see who Kamala Harris, because she will win, in my estimation, chooses as her attorney general.
The irony of what you're just describing to me is the immunity decision, and that if you take a sober look and give the justices in the majority the benefit of the doubt, okay, they purport to be following the Constitution and doing this in a even-handed, apolitical way. The best argument for that immunity decision is that we have to fear prosecutors, that prosecutors are out of control, that if someone does what you're describing, that is just going to be a nightmare for presidents for the rest of the history of America, because it'll just ping pong back and forth with these monstrous prosecutors bringing charges. And the part that they missed is around January 6th. I mean, it's about egregious as it comes. They seem to act at just blink away the fact of January 6th. But I would say, that immunity decision, again, made what you're describing even more difficult, because they seem to be pointing fingers at the bad guys being prosecutors. And as you and I both know, these are career public servants. They care deeply about their job. They care deeply about doing the right thing. They give up big, fancy, lucrative jobs in law firms. They take a lot of public scrutiny. They work round the clock. And I really take issue with the tone of the majority in that regard, and including people that worked within the executive branch of the presidency.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kim. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was so fun as always. Thank you, Glenn, for having me.